Have you ever sat in your car before work and asked yourself one frightening question? If hard work is supposed to build a better life, why does my life still feel stuck? What if the real crisis is not that people stopped wanting to work, but that millions stopped believing work would ever love them back? If you want clear ideas instead of lazy cliches, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one person who has felt this exact frustration, but never had the words for it. Picture a woman named Elena in the summer of 2021. She is 32, living in Orlando, managing the front desk at a medical clinic. She's not reckless. She's not spoiled. She's not someone who quits when life gets hard. For 10 years, she has done what people told her to do. Be reliable, be patient, say yes to extra hours, stay professional, keep your head down, build trust, build seniority, build a future. And for a while, that story made sense. She got promoted twice. She trained new staff. She answered patient calls during lunch. She filled gaps when coworkers called out. She learned the software no one else wanted to learn. She even took work home in her head, replaying tense conversations, fixing tomorrow's problems before tomorrow arrived. But then, something started to feel wrong. Her rent went up faster than her paycheck. Groceries became a weekly insult. Her health insurance existed, but using it still felt expensive. Her phone never really turned off. Her boss talked about team spirit while cutting hours and demanding more flexibility. Every month, Elena worked harder to protect a life that felt less secure. One afternoon, she opened her banking app in the break room and just stared. Not because she had done something irresponsible, because she had done almost everything right, and it still was not enough. That moment matters, because that moment is where this whole story begins. The phrase, "no one wants to work anymore," sounds simple, but it hides a much more dangerous truth. People do want food. They want shelter. They want purpose. They want dignity. They want a future they can trust. What they do not want is to keep pouring energy into a system that keeps raising the price of survival while shrinking the reward for effort. That is the real reason this conversation feels so emotional. It is not just about jobs. It is about betrayal. For decades, millions of people were raised on a promise. It was not always spoken out loud, but it was everywhere. In classrooms, in family advice, in political speeches, in movies, in the tone adults used when they said things like, "just work hard and you'll be fine." The promise was simple. If you show up, stay disciplined, and keep contributing, life should slowly become more stable. Maybe not luxurious, maybe not easy, but better. Now look at what has happened over the last few decades. Workers became more productive. Technology improved, communication sped up. Tasks that once took hours could be done in minutes. Companies learned to track more, measure more, demand more, and squeeze more from every hour. In theory, that should have created broader comfort. If people produce more value, their lives should get easier, or at least more secure. But that is not what millions experienced. Instead, people watched paychecks crawl while costs sprinted. Housing got heavier. Education got pricier. Childcare started sounding like a luxury product. Healthcare kept punishing people for getting sick. Stable schedules disappeared. Benefits weakened. Pensions faded. Loyalty stopped being rewarded, but availability was still expected. So workers adapted in the only honest way people can adapt. They realized the map no longer matches the road. They became more cautious, more skeptical, more emotionally distant from jobs that were emotionally consuming them. And then the pandemic hit like a giant spotlight. A lot of people describe the Great Resignation as if the pandemic caused workers to suddenly become soft or unrealistic. That misses the point completely. The pandemic did not create the crack in the system. It lit up the crack so brightly that millions could no longer pretend it was not there. And during that same period, many people got a brutal mental comparison they had never made so clearly before. They saw how much of their life had been handed over to work, and they asked what they were getting back. That question changed everything. Not because everyone found a better job overnight. Most people did not. Not because everyone became financially secure enough to walk away. Most people were not. The change happened because once a person sees that the old promise is broken, they cannot unsee it. They may still stay. They may still need the paycheck. But something inside the relationship dies. That is what so many employers misunderstood. They thought workers were rejecting effort. In reality, workers were rejecting a deal that no longer felt fair. There is a huge difference between those two things. But remove that belief, and motivation changes shape. Now overtime feels like theft. Flexibility starts to sound like exploitation. Team culture sounds hollow. We're a family here begins to feel like a warning instead of a comfort. The Employee of the Month plaque means nothing if the person receiving it still cannot afford an emergency. This is why the lazy explanation fails so badly. If people were simply allergic to work, we would not see millions juggling multiple tasks. Side gigs, freelance tasks, delivery apps, caregiving, and household labor at the same time. We would not see exhausted parents logging in before sunrise and answering emails after bedtime. We would not see students working while studying, or older workers delaying retirement because they cannot afford to stop. The issue is not that people hate effort. The issue is that effort has stopped feeling like a reliable bridge to security. That is a very different emotional reality. And once you understand that, a lot of modern behavior starts making sense. Quiet quitting was not really about quitting. In many cases, it was people refusing to donate unpaid emotional labor to institutions that had already made clear that devotion would not be returned. Job hopping was not just impatience. Often, it was the only remaining way to get meaningful raises in a system that rewarded external leverage more than internal loyalty. Remote work was not merely convenience. For many workers, it was the first visible proof that whole sections of their working life had always been more about control than productivity. When people got a tiny taste of time back, they noticed how starved they had been. And time is a big part of this story. Modern work does not only consume labor, it consumes attention. Before the shift, recovery after the shift, and emotional energy during every hour in between. That kind of pressure changes how people interpret reward. It is not just, am I earning enough money? It becomes, is the money worth what this job is doing to my mind, my family, my sleep, my health, and my sense of self? More and more people started answering no. And that answer did not come from nowhere. It came from watching the math stop making emotional sense. Maybe your paycheck rose a little, but your landlord took more. Maybe you got a promotion, but your workload doubled. Maybe you got benefits, but using them still left you in debt. Maybe you were called essential, but treated as disposable. Maybe you followed every productivity tip on earth, yet still felt one emergency away from panic. That is not a motivation problem. That is a broken bargain. And here's the part that hits even harder. The people saying no one wants to work anymore often do not realize they are saying something else. What they often mean is, people no longer want to accept the terms they used to accept. Those are not the same complaint. A business can have openings and still fail to attract workers if the pay is weak, the schedule is chaotic, or the culture is disrespectful, or if the future feels non-existent. A worker can need money and still hesitate to take a job that drains them. The job exists. The labor exists. The missing piece is trust. Once trust erodes, even normal workplace problems become much heavier. A rude manager is not just rude anymore. They become evidence that your dignity is cheap. A denied raise is not just disappointing. It becomes proof that effort and reward have separated. A canceled day off is not just an inconvenience. It feels like another tiny theft from a life already being rented out in pieces. This is why the emotional tone around work changed so fast. On the surface, it looked like workers suddenly got dramatic. Underneath, a long build-up finally reached language. For years, many people had been swallowing the same quiet realization. I am giving more than I'm getting back, and the gap keeps widening. That realization is destabilizing because it attacks identity. Most people do not build their lives around being lazy. They build their lives around being useful, responsible, dependable, needed. So when work stops rewarding those traits, people lose more than money. They lose a story about who they are and how the world works. If this is putting words to something you have felt for years, subscribe now, tap like, and share this video. Share this with the most hardworking person you know, because they deserve to hear that their exhaustion is not imaginary. That is one reason the Great Resignation felt bigger than a labor trend. It felt like a cultural mood shift. Millions of workers were not just changing jobs, they were grieving an old belief. The belief was this: if I keep proving myself, the system will eventually meet me halfway. For many, halfway never came. In some industries, it got worse. Retail workers had to smile through staffing shortages. Teachers were asked to fix social problems with shrinking support. Healthcare workers were praised with speeches and burned out. Tech workers discovered that high salaries did not guarantee emotional safety when layoffs could arrive by email. Creative workers were told to be grateful for exposure while producing constant content. Gig workers got freedom with no safety net. Even white-collar professionals felt one restructuring away from free fall. That is why this issue crossed class lines in such a powerful way. The details changed, but the emotional message was similar. Whether you wore scrubs, steel-toe boots, business casual, or a headset, the same suspicion kept growing. The system wants my best, but it does not want to share the future my best is supposed to build. Suddenly, old workplace slogans stop working. Be grateful you have a job loses force when the job still leaves you unstable. Start at the bottom, and work your way up feels weaker when the ladder itself looks cracked. Go above and beyond sounds foolish, when above and beyond mainly earns more tasks, not more security. Stick with the company rings hollow when the company can cut you loose in a quarter and call it strategy. That recognition is powerful. Once workers can compare notes at scale, the old gaslighting loses power. It becomes harder to tell people, this is just your attitude, when millions are describing the same pattern. Now here is the deeper layer most conversations miss. Work is not only an economic exchange, it is a psychological contract. Money matters, obviously, but so do respect, predictability, fairness, control, and meaning. If pay is imperfect but dignity is strong, many people will stay. If work is hard, but the path upward is visible, many people will stay. If the schedule is rough, but the sacrifice clearly improves life, many people will stay. But if pay feels thin, respect feels fake, the schedule feels hostile, advancement feels blocked, and the future feels smaller, then even decent people with strong work ethics begin to disconnect. Not because their character collapsed, because the contract collapsed. This is why the phrase "people don't want to work" is so misleading. Work is not one thing. There is meaningful work and meaningless work. There is stable work and chaotic work. There is respected work and humiliating work. There is work that builds a life and work that eats a life. When millions reject the second kind, that is not social decay. That is information. It tells you the deal on offer is failing. Look at how people actually behave when the deal improves. If wages rise enough, applicants return. If schedules become more humane, retention improves. If workers gain real flexibility, satisfaction often jumps. If managers show respect and create clear paths forward, people stay longer. That alone destroys the idea that workers have mysteriously lost the will to contribute. The will is still there. Conditions shape whether it can breathe. And this is where the broken economic promise becomes impossible to ignore. For a long time, modern economies sold people two fantasies at once. First, that markets would reward value fairly. Second, that institutions would take care of loyal contributors in the long run. In reality, many workers learned that value can be extracted without being shared. And loyalty can be admired without being protected. That lesson changes a person. It changes how they negotiate, how they save, how they trust, how they date, how many children they feel safe having, whether they move cities, whether they help family, whether they dare to rest. When work no longer feels like a platform under life and starts feeling like a storm over life, every other decision becomes more defensive. This is part of why so many people seem less patient now. It is not simply shorter attention spans, it is thinner margins. People with thin margins cannot absorb endless nonsense. They cannot smile through every insult, every policy change, or every surprise, every fake emergency, every demand for passion from leaders who offer no reciprocal loyalty. They are not weak, they are saturated, and saturation changes behavior quickly. Some people resign dramatically, others detach quietly, some reduce spending and downsize their dreams. Some chase certifications, some build side incomes, some move back home, some stay in the job but mentally leave it. Some burn out so deeply that even applying elsewhere feels impossible. The responses differ. The root feeling is often the same: this is not worth what it is costing me. That sentence might be the hidden slogan of the entire era. And notice something important. It is not always a greedy sentence. Sometimes it comes from people who would have accepted less money if they had more time, or more respect, or more stability, or a manager who treated them like an adult, or a schedule they could build a family around, or the simple belief that next year would be better instead of tighter. In other words, the revolt was not only about wages, it was about the total quality of the exchange. Money is part of dignity, but dignity is bigger than money. That is why some workers left prestigious jobs. Outsiders saw salary, insiders felt erosion. Titles do not cancel anxiety. Benefits do not erase meaninglessness. A polished office does not repair a life with no room left in it. And that brings us to something uncomfortable but necessary. A lot of institutions still behave as if workers should be infinitely adaptive, while the institution itself changes nothing important. Be resilient, be flexible, upskill, rebrand yourself, stay positive. Manage stress better, optimize your morning, drink more water, download a meditation app. So what is the real reason no one wants to work anymore? Because more and more people can feel that the modern economy has broken the emotional and material link between effort and reward. Because they were told work would create security, and for many it created constant anxiety instead. Because they were told loyalty mattered, then watched loyalty become a one-way obligation. Because they were told productivity would lift everyone, then watched the gains pile up somewhere else. Because they were told to be patient, then realized patience was being used as a management strategy against them. Because they were told burnout was a personal weakness when it was often an institutional design feature. Because they were told this was the price of adulthood, while the adults themselves looked more exhausted and less protected. And because once enough people see that pattern clearly, the old language stops working. You cannot shame people back into belief after belief has been broken. That is the part many leaders still fail to understand. Motivation is not something you can demand forever from the outside. It grows when people can connect sacrifice to outcome. When that connection snaps, speeches get weaker, threats get weaker, corporate slogans get weaker, even fear gets weaker eventually. Because at some point, a person would rather risk change than keep financing a life that feels permanently cornered. And if we keep misreading that message, the frustration will deepen. Not because people suddenly lost morals, but because systems that keep breaking promises eventually produce emotional withdrawal. People can survive hard work. What they struggle to survive is hard work that feels empty and disconnected from a future they can trust. That is why this moment matters. It is about whether the next generation looks at work and sees a ladder or sees a treadmill. It is about whether sacrifice feels meaningful again. It is about whether institutions finally understand that people are not machines. Because if they do not understand that, the phrase, "no one wants to work anymore," will keep returning as a warning. If this video is helping you see the pattern, send it to a friend, hit subscribe, and press like only if you know the story is bigger. And when that promise fails, people do not always riot. Often, they do something quieter and more dangerous for the system. They stop believing. They give less. They trust less. They dream smaller. They detach. They leave, one by one, until the numbers become too large to dismiss, and everyone starts pretending they have no idea what happened. But now you do know what happened. People did not wake up one morning and decide work was evil. They woke up to the possibility that the deal they were defending no longer existed. That is a completely different story. When someone says nobody wants to work anymore, they might be standing in the ruins of a promise they do not know has collapsed. A promise about fairness, mobility, and dignity. The real question is not why workers changed. The real question is why the deal got worse and why so many powerful people still act shocked that workers noticed. They noticed with their budgets, their stress, their delayed milestones, and their tired eyes in the bathroom mirror before another shift. And once a society reaches that point, it cannot lecture its way back to trust. It has to rebuild the deal. Until that happens, people will keep saying they do not want to work, when what they really mean is far more human. They do want to work. They just do not want to keep sacrificing their lives for a promise that no longer keeps its word.